So good afternoon, everyone. Oh, good afternoon. So welcome, everyone, and thanks for coming to today's seminar. So today we're going to be presenting findings from a large 3-year study that we've been conducting, funded by the Australian Research Council. So it's a really great opportunity to present this data to you. We're very fortunate that we have all the CIs, the chief investigators involved in the study here today, including David Bass, who's being beamed live from the UK with a bit of a time delay, maybe of a few weeks, but he'll be opening the study in a second. Let me just start by just acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands which we stand, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to elders both past and present. It's really exciting to be here today. We've got a whole host of speakers. We've got 2 hours to tell you everything we know about this study so you don't want to hear from me too much. We're also pleased to be streaming this live through a webcast. So we have about 40 people online at the moment, and hopefully some more will be joining us. And also the whole content will be video. So if you miss something really important or you find it so exciting that you want to go home and watch it again, we'll let you know how you can do that. Or if any of your colleagues have missed this and would like to know a bit more about it, you're able to rewatch it again. And most of the videos that we have, most of the talks we have here at Turning Point, so we run a monthly seminar series called Talking Point. They are all recorded, and if people want to see those content, they're all available on our Talking Point part of the Turning Point website. So without further ado, let me just get my able assistant here, Ramez, to get David up. David, are you there? He is there. So let me just introduce David Bass for people who don't know him. So David is a leading figure in the area of addiction and recovery. He's published over 150 reviewed papers, more than 50 policy and research reports, and he's a world-renowned figure in the area of addiction recovery. David worked with us here. We were very fortunate for a number of years here at Turning Point, and has now returned to the UK working at Sheffield Hallam as Professor of Criminology. And he's going to be giving an overview of the study, its methods, and a bit of background to why we're conducting the study. So over to you, David.
Hello and welcome to the SONAR launch event. My name is David Best. I am Professor of Criminology at Sheffield Hallam University. But really I'm here, and it's my great privilege to be here as one of the principal investigators on the social networks and recovery study. This has been a major undertaking and has been a huge achievement for the team and for the TCs who have participated. What we have produced is not only a phenomenal piece of research, but it's also something that will create a repository for further students and for practitioners to investigate what goes on with social networks, social identity, and the whole process of recovery through therapeutic use in Australia. We've done this because we've had a tremendous team. The team consists from Victoria of Professor Lubman, who's the Director of Turning Point, myself, although I'm not at Turning Point as much now, Michael Savic, Ramez, Bathish, and Melinda, Beckwith, and from Deakin University, Associate Professor Petra, Staiger. We have been joined by the team from Queensland, who consist of Professor Haslam, Associate Professor Dingle, and John McKenzie. It has been an incredible coming together of a genuinely multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary team who brought various kinds of expertise in the addictions field, in recovery, and in social networks and identity theory. And it's allowed us to develop this incredibly strong, rich partnership, and to have credibility, I think, with some of the TCs who took part. So it's also important to say that while we are launching the project results now, and the event is effectively a celebration of what we've done today, this is by no means the end. There's a lot of work for us still to do to analyse what's a huge database of well over 700 completed instruments, including social identity maps from virtually everybody who took part. So it's been a big, big achievement. And really all I intend to do is kind of set the scene for you, to tell you a little bit about where the project came from and how it's operationalised and materialised. I'm not going to go through a lot of the discussion about what do we mean by recovery, but there are some important things to start with, which is that sense that recovery is a complex phenomenon. It's not just about sobriety, it's about participation in society, global health and well-being, and that fits very well with a TC philosophy. It's also important to say that Pat Deegan's point for mental health is it's a personal, subjective process. It's not just about objective change, it's changing how you feel as well as what you do. From a service point of view, the mental health acronym of China plays out. For a service to effectively deliver recovery, it has to do this minimum of 5 things. This is kind of sine qua non of recovery process. It has to create connections and connectedness. It has to generate hope. People have to be able to change their identity, and again, that changed very well with the process of TCs. People have to have a sense of meaning and purpose in their lives, and they have to be empowered by the process, CHIM. It's also about transitioning from that sense of what's good is about pleasure to what's good is about a sense of meaning and giving back. And I promise there'll be no further references to Aristotle, at least in the course of my talk. You're not here to hear a literature review. We've done a strong and systematic review, and you can read about this or contact us to find out more. But we know relatively little about how and why people recover. And this study will contribute significantly. This will be one of the largest outcome studies in this area, and the fact that we have a large sample followed up over 3 time points is critical to our understanding. We know that there's marked variability in relapse rates post-treatment, and one of the things that we've known for a long time is that continuity of care matters. What we're drilling down to in this study is kind of why. What is it about treatment? What is it about retransitioning to the community? And we've looked at it through a particular lens. That particular lens is primarily the social lens. What is it about groups and transitions in groups that really matter in this process? So there's a body of work that we've borrowed from: the importance of social networks and support, the importance of moving away from prior social networks that were associated with offending and substance use, and the underpinning process, which is about identity change. And that identity change was traditionally thought of in the work of McKechnie and Biernacki and people like that, was originally thought of as a kind of personal identity change. Our work has changed the focus of it to say identity largely stems from the groups you belong to. And in essence, what we have added to the literature is not a move away from identity models or theories, but the understanding of what identity is and how identity plays out in risk situations. What does that mean? Well, what that means is we assume there's a complex 3-way dynamic of how people change. That for people to develop the capital they need to sustain recovery, the literature is clear that once people reach about 5 years of sober time, their recovery becomes self-sustaining. What enables them to do that is building the personal resources, what we call personal recovery capital, things like self-esteem, self-efficacy, resilience, but that doesn't grow on its own. That requires a kind of scaffolding round about it. And that scaffolding takes 2 forms. In the most immediate sense, the urgent priority is the support of pro-social social networks. And we know that the engagement with sober peers and recovery groups and communities creates that scaffolding. It creates social influence, it creates social learning, and it creates social control. But that's underpinned by the bottom part, community or collective recovery capital, which is how society responds to the person's efforts. Do they exclude and stigmatise, or do they create opportunities for houses, jobs, and effective reintegration? And the work of our colleagues in Queensland really significantly contributed. This previous slide is work that I've done 7 or 8 years ago in conjunction with Alexandra Lodi from New York. But what the Queensland heritage in this project really has been about is about a much broader work based on a book called The Social Cure that Jolanda Jett, Kat and Alex Haslam published in 2012 around how connections, belonging to groups, has a protective effect. And that protective effect is sufficiently strong that it can change health outcomes in things like recovery from stroke and recovery from heart attacks. Group group membership creates not only social support and access to resource, it creates access to shared values and shared belief systems that allow people to manage complex situations. And our early partnership work, evidenced by Genevieve's paper in 2015 and Melinda's paper in 2016, really showed with one of our TC sites that people who switch in the TC from an identity primarily around their using group to one around recovery show significantly enhanced recovery outcomes. And this allowed our partnership, our research team, to develop something called the social identity model of recovery, where we analysed the process of transitioning from using groups to mixed models of groups to recovery groups as a process of identity change predicated on the commitment and salience of recovery identities. In other words, value systems, beliefs and behavioural repertoires change in part as a consequence of the groups you belong to. In the paper we said recovery is a personal journey of socially negotiated identity transition that occurs through changes in social networks and related meaningful activities. So for this project, and we need to thank the Australian Research Council for their support of the project, we started with some basic assumptions. Recovery is linked to identity and particularly change in the course of recovery. Positive networks build positive social and recovery capital, and the TC effectively creates in that developmental model a window of opportunity, a safe space to allow identity transition through group change that's potentially sustainable. The social group creates rules and values, and one of the questions we wanted to ask was, how do we map and measure them? And we created a new measure, a new visualization technique called social identity mapping to support this process. Just before I get into that, I'll say what the study aims were. To investigate social network and social identity change during and after TC treatment. We worked on the assumption that most therapeutic community planned residences were 6 months. So the study design was to pick people up at baseline, near to completion, and 6 months later. To investigate how changes in social networks and social identities affect all the standard treatment outcomes: alcohol and drug use, offending, housing, social engagement, well-being. We wanted to look at the relationship between group membership and identity on the one hand, and to see which plays a more significant role. Is it about belonging to groups, or how you perceive yourself as a member of groups? The design was a 3-year longitudinal outcome study. We recruited 300 people. We actually slightly exceeded our target in 5 residential rehabilitations, 2 in Victoria, 2 in Queensland and 1 in New South Wales. It was a complex nested study, so there was a qualitative subcomponent. We developed the social identity mapping tool, and there was one PhD linked to the project as well. What we tried to do was to map through basic information about participants, their demographics, their current well-being, the recovery capital and functioning scores, social connections, social networks and social identity, and particularly with the PhD in Melbourne, we also wanted to look at stigma. So those were the basic measures and mechanisms we used. We used a self-report design. It was a mixed methods approach because we had qualitative and quantitative techniques. And essentially what we did was we utilised that as a way of effectively measuring and mapping belonging and identity as a predictor of outcome. And this gives you an example of the kind of things we mean by social identity mapping tools. There'll be more of this as we go on, but I wanted to introduce you to this idea of a complex research design that has strong clinical implications. So what we got people to do, and this started much, much earlier with some partnership work with Odyssey House in Victoria, where we started saying, rather than get people to fill in long, complex tables about their social networks, let's get them to visualise it. To visualise it and then colour code it according to the riskiness or protectiveness of the group. So where there are large chunks of red dots, what in effect we are saying is there's high riskiness of frequent and regular users. Where there are green and blue dots, the groups are much more protective. Now, immediately when we first piloted this, there was huge participant engagement in the process and task, and we've made this much, much more systematic over the course of the SONAR study. Again, the person positions themselves in the centre of the map, and then their groups effectively create mechanisms for saying, what do I have to do to sustain my recovery, what groups will support it, and what groups will draw me back into using lifestyles and networks. It's a very powerful mechanism to create reflection and for clinical processes to develop around, so what do we do about this? How do we change, and what's the urgency with which we need to change social networks to enable change? So you're going to hear a lot more about what we've done and what we've found, who the sample were over the course of today. But I just wanted to summarise the importance of the study. It's the first ever multi-site prospective study of social identity and recovery outcomes in Australia. It's the first such study that uses the TC setting as a crucial setting for mapping identity change. It's created a very strong and sustainable partnership between experts in various fields, resulting in over 700 completed questionnaires. This project you will hear about today has already had some impact, but really, as is the nature of research, the full impact will only come about in the coming years, because we anticipate a significant number of research publications and research to practice dissemination efforts. Please get involved, please support us. This is now a huge resource, academically and intellectually as well as practically. And I hope over the coming hours you'll get a sense of our excitement at what we've done, and a sense that you are welcome to join us in moving this forward. I apologise that I can't be there with you today. Thank you all very much for your support of the project, and look forward to being involved with you as we move forward. Thank you.
So thanks, David. Live from the UK. Modern technology, isn't it great? I think we're okay. There's some lights in the switch if people want them at the end. So hopefully David's given you a bit of a nice overview. So this study is really this 3-year study. We're very fortunate to work with a number of TCs across multiple jurisdictions. We were able to recruit over 300 people and to follow a significant number over the next 12 months. And really gives us a really good understanding of what happens to people over time, what changes, what's the impact of change in social identity and social connections, and how does that lead to different outcomes. And what we hope to share with you over the next sort of 90 minutes really is around some of the key findings from the study and some thoughts around sort of what impact this might have for policy and practice. So because we're trying to sort of contain it and we have over 50 people online, what we'd like people to do, for the online people particularly, if they wouldn't mind, if they can ask questions at any time. So we'll be collecting all those questions. For the audience here, just keep your questions in your head. And then what we'll do is we won't take any questions until the end, and then we'll have a question and answer session to finish on, and then we'll be asking the whole panel a series of questions. So if people can just hold their questions while they can. So let me introduce the next speaker. So it's my pleasure to introduce Ramez Bathish. Ramez led the recruitment and oversight of the study here in Victoria. Was involved in hundreds and hundreds of assessments, so knows very personally the stories and the outcomes for individual people, and he'll be telling us around some of the baseline characteristics of people within the study and some really interesting relationships. So please welcome Ramez.
Thanks, guys. So, well, we're already a bit behind, so I'll get cracking. I'll be talking about the participant characteristics of our sample, but also we've got quite a rich and detailed data set, so I'll be drilling down, just focusing on one story out of the data as well as giving you an overview of the sample. So, as David mentioned previously, we recruited 307 people from across 5 TCs in Eastern Australia, 2 from Victoria, 2 in Queensland, and 1 in New South Wales. And for those of you who aren't familiar with therapeutic communities, TCs are an abstinence-based alcohol and drug treatment modality. They're a residential treatment modality, and I guess they're a particular kind of residential rehab. So they typically offer a medium to long-term alcohol and drug treatment. Many TCs offer treatment for 3 to 6 months, and others are longer. So they'll treat people for 12 months and even longer at times. And so previous research has demonstrated that stable long-term treatment in TCs is associated with substantial reductions in substance use, overdose, needle sharing, as well as substantial improvements in health and well-being. And there are 2 types of factors broadly associated with better TC outcomes. And so there are treatment characteristics, and largely the main predictor in terms of treatment characteristics is treatment retention, so treatment dose. And in terms of client characteristics, these fall into 3 broad categories, I guess. There's alcohol and drug use, there's demographic characteristics, so age and gender, and then more recent research has shown that social and psychosocial factors are also important in predicting outcomes. So TCs have historically been associated with the treatment of people experiencing social disadvantage and with long histories of alcohol and drug problems. However, with shifts in alcohol and drug markets over the last few decades, this profile has changed somewhat. Well, in particular, the profile of people's primary drug of concern. So clearly this isn't a new story, that of increasing methamphetamine use. But interestingly, in research that was recently conducted at Turning Point, led by Dan Lubman and Vic Manning, that research showed that people with primary methamphetamines problems actually have better outcomes following treatment. And we're not really sure why that is, but some of the data in our data set might point towards a possible explanation. So you can see here on one hand we have an increase of those with primary meth problems, of primary amphetamines problems, and a corresponding decrease in those presenting to rehabs with primary alcohol problems, primary opioids problems, and primary cannabis problems. Turning now to our own data set, now that we've kind of set the context a little. There's nothing really particularly surprising here. So 2/3 of our sample roughly were male. We had an average age of about 35 years. 90% were born in Australia. The vast majority were unemployed at entry to the TC. And almost 1 in 5 reported no income source. And many of these people who reported no income source were those who had to leave a job and were just living off their savings while they were in the TC. Another interesting item here is the number of participants with dependent children. So that was 1 in 3. Drilling down a little bit more into some risk factors in the month prior to admission. So a bit more than 1 in 4 were at risk of eviction, and about a quarter also reported either primary or secondary homelessness. Similar amount reported being a victim of violence, and again a similar amount reported being a perpetrator of violence. About 1 in 3 reported current legal issues, and about 25% reported a hospital admission or an ambulance attendance in the month prior to treatment. So looking now at how our sample compares to some other recent data sets. So the first data set here is from the WHO's TC in Sydney. We have a fairly sizable rehab subsample in the patient pathway study, which consists of both TCs and also other types of rehabs. I believe there were about 40% TCs in that sample. And we've got our sample here. So while you probably wouldn't want to lean too heavily on these data, as there's there's differences in the different samples, we can see that the demographics are fairly consistent. So we've got similar ages, similar percentages of male admissions, also similar levels of unemployment, and roughly similar levels of prior residential alcohol and drug treatment. Turning now to prior treatment of our sample. So about 1 in 10 had no prior experience with rehab, detox or alcohol and drug counselling. Most had prior engagement with a mental health professional. About 7 in 10 had prior experience with alcohol and drug counselling, and a similar figure had been to a detox at a previous time. And then about 1 in 3 had attended a mutual aid group in the past. In terms of alcohol and drug use history, the average age of first use of the primary drug of concern was 17, and people reported on average that they'd used their primary problem substance for about 10 years. Looking now at the number of prior TC admissions of our sample. So we see here that 2/3 of participants had never been to a TC at admission, and a further 20% had only had 1 admission, and then it's about 13% for 2 or more admissions. So most people were naive to TC treatment. Looking now at alcohol and drug use. So alcohol was the most commonly reported substance that was consumed, followed by tobacco, and then amphetamine type stimulants, just edging out cannabis there, and cocaine coming in last at 20%. Drilling down to look at substance use in the month prior, people reported on average using their primary drug of concern for 20 days out of 28. About half were engaged in daily PDOC use, and about 70% were engaged in daily alcohol and drug use, with about 40% reporting injection drug use in the month prior. Turning back again to this comparison with the other data sets, and looking now at alcohol and drug use, we can see that while levels of injection drug use are fairly similar across the WHO's sample and the SONAR sample, as well with the number of drug classes used, there has been a significant change over the years. And in our sample now, we can see that most people indeed are reporting primary methamphetamines problems. So 2 minutes, wow. Okay, I'll get moving. So drilling down then to see how those with primary meth problems compare to those with primary alcohol and primary opioids problems, because those 3 groups made up 92% of the sample or so. So we can see that meth users, or those with primary meth problems rather, were significantly younger. They'd had significantly shorter periods of problem use, and their age of use was significantly higher. And also, I guess it's more down to pharmacokinetics, but their daily PDOC use was lower. Also, interestingly, in terms of social capital and social connectedness, those with primary meth problems reported a much larger social network size, reported belonging to many more group memberships, and also they reported higher recovery capital. Turning now just to some correlates of problem drug use across the sample. And I just wanted to just flag this in advance of the talks to come, just highlighting that social capital and recovery capital are negatively associated with years of primary PDOC, rather years of problem PDOC use, and positively associated with well-being. So to summarise, we've had meth replace alcohol as the largest proportion of those presenting with primary meth problems. Meth users report a much shorter history of problem use. They have more intact social connections, and thinking back to those better alcohol and drug treatment outcomes that the previous Turning Point study highlighted, we think this might be down to differences in their drug and alcohol use trajectories, but also the greater social and other resources that's available to them. And so I guess this study highlights that while meth use has been in the media a lot, we shouldn't forget those with other primary problems. So at least in this sample, those with alcohol and opioids primary problems seem to have more complex needs. They were more isolated and had higher alcohol and drug use severity, for instance. And so it's important not to, I think these data highlight that it's important not to just treat the individual in isolation, and that we need to account for social factors in treatment. Treatment providers in particular are well positioned to help people map out their social networks, and the speakers that will follow will go into that in more detail. I might leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks, Ramez. So that gives you a nice overview of the study and the characteristics of people in the study, and some really interesting baseline findings that sort of ask questions around sort of, who does better in treatment and potential mechanisms why. So we're going to move on. David showed you in his talk some really nice, pretty pictures that you're all amazed about, and we're now going to teach you how you can create these for yourself at home. So I'm going to introduce Melinda Beckwith, who is a psychologist and is completing a PhD on this project and look at the role between stigma and identity and how that impacts on recovery. But she's going to take us through the development of these maps and sort of to give you a better understanding about how we create these maps and how they might be a potential use in a clinical setting. So please welcome Melinda.
So thank you, Ramez. Thank you, David, for opening the show. And as mentioned, my job today is to introduce to you a key innovation that we have developed as part of this project that David briefly told us about, that we think does have important clinical implications, can be used as a research tool and a clinical tool. And that is social identity mapping. I'm going to have two different clicky things here. So why have we used this tool? This is just a kind of a brief background to expand on what David's talked about. So as David talked about, recovery is not just an objective phenomenon that we measure and capture and see in clinical practice. It's also about a change in personal perspective and how people feel about who they are in the world. And so we know sustained recovery is predicted by changes in the network. But we've captured that quite objectively. We've also captured that by talking to people about how they feel about their recovery. And when people talk about their networks, they actually talk more about groups than they do about the individuals that they hang out with. So when we talk about composition, we're looking at composition in terms of who uses substances and who doesn't. And the other part to that is the subjective experience that people have of that process of them changing who they are and their sense of self. So therefore, we looked at for a method that kind of tied these changes in the network to a subjective change in identity, but we wanted one that had a clear theoretical link between the two, so we could see how these things worked in together, because no project to date has actually linked those two. They've just been disparate findings so far. So to do this, we drew on the social identity approach, which Kath and Jen have done a lot of research on in various fields, and it's great that they've been here to share their expertise with us. So the social identity approach in brief tells us that social identities that people hold are underpinned by the groups that they belong to. And these can be broad groups, they can be vegans or Melburnians or drug and alcohol workers, or it can be smaller groups like your family or your friends or your class that you went through school with, whatever you've got. But it's not just the groups that you might be lumped into, it's those that you have some emotional connection to and that hold some significance to you that will shape your internalised sense of who you are. And that's furnished by the social norms that those groups come with that are distinct for those particular groups. So that might be beliefs, behaviours, so on and so forth. And of course, here we're looking specifically at substance use. So, double click. As David explained, this led us to develop the social identity model of recovery, where we're looking at people's social identities around their substance use being underpinned by the groups that they belong to and the norms of those groups. And so we're looking at recovery as a process of moving away from groups whose norms are based in heavy substance use towards groups whose norms are based in other things that are more recovery supportive. But the question is, how do we actually capture that? So this is why we've developed this tool. What it is a visual representation that combines two different things. So it combines the social identity mapping that Kath and Jen and friends have been developing, but also using some items from well-developed measures that have led us to these findings around recovery being that change in social networks. So it's combining two evidence-based aspects to capture on a group-based level the substance use support within a network that might underpin that change in identity. So what does it do? Well, I'm going backwards, forwards, right. So together what this allows us to capture is the multiple social network groups that underpin a person's social identities around substance use, but also it captures the substance use norms of these groups that inform these social identities around substance use, either a using or recovery or both. And what we need to remember is the important thing about this is how those things change over time. So we need to have a way to quantify this. The benefits of doing it in this particular way is that it gives us a concrete way to address a very abstract concept. So I've just done a lot of talking to kind of explain that to you, and if I asked you then to explain back how your social world fit that, it would be really difficult. And doing that in terms of just surveys about the list of people you have in your world and how much you identify with particular things, it doesn't really give us or the participants we're talking to any sense of how those might connect. Whereas social mapping does do that. People can actually see and explain to you in pictures what their world looks like and how the different elements of that, how their social norms tie into what is going on for them in terms of their addiction. So it ties in with other methods that you'll probably already be familiar with from clinical practice. Node link mapping has been trialled in the AOD field for many years. There's good evidence that as a tool provides a better way for people to communicate complex information. So what we mean by node link mapping is you have chunks of information linked to other chunks of information, and that link tells us how the information is related. You've probably all done this when trying to explain something to someone, when trying to work out a process, when trying to work out how different bits of information fit together. So it's probably something that's quite familiar to you, as well as genograms, which is used quite a lot in a lot of different clinical practice, where there's a clear structure, there's manuals, there's books dedicated to this that tell you how to construct a genogram so that someone else can come along and look at it and know exactly what that means. So we've tried to create a similar visual structure or visual grammar for our maps using what we know. So basically what this is all about, it does look like a big mess, but there's actually quite a good structure to it. So the yellow boxes are the groups people belong to. We have used post-it notes because this is quite complex and sophisticated, as we talked about. So the size of those groups tells us how important those groups are to a person. The dots on those groups tell us about the substance use of the members within those groups. So red, we've been really cryptic here. Red is for heavy use, danger. Yellow is for casual or maybe social use. Blue is for non-use. Recovery is denoted by green dots, and that's for people who used to have a problem but now are not using. And then we have a white dot for people who we don't know what they're doing. Then we have the lines that tell us how all those groups relate to each other and to the person themselves, or how the person relates to their groups. Blue lines are for how much a person has in common or the groups have in common, and red lines are for how much conflict might exist in those relationships. So what does it tell us about what we want to know about these social group norms, about identity? Well, the first thing is about the social group norms. And we have based our conceptualisation of this on the dominant patterns that we can see in each group. So we've categorised groups as either high risk or low risk groups in terms of what risk they pose to the person continuing to use. So low risk groups, we've used blue and green dots, and if those colours are dominant in a person's group, then we would class that as low risk. On the other side, if we have majority red dots, we're looking at that as a high risk group because there is a lot of heavy use going on. If it's 50-50, we haven't categorised them as either, and so there's a number of different groups that we haven't been able to categorise. This is probably more a problem for alcohol use than for drug use because we have a lot of groups that everyone was just a social user. So we found that that wasn't as much of a risk to the person as heavy use in terms of alcohol or drugs. So we've just stuck with, if there's all red dots, then that's bad. That's high risk. So what does it tell us then about how that links to identity? Well, what we're looking for here is about how network composition is linked to substance use identity or substance using identity, recovery identity, and then in the long-term outcomes. This is at admission, so this is cross-sectional data, and you can see what we're wanting to see here is pluses in the blue boxes and minuses in the green boxes. So we're capturing that an association between high-risk groups and the proportion of high-risk groups in someone's network and their using identity, and low-risk groups in a person's network and their recovery identity. But at a cross-sectional level, it's not quite the same. So this is an admission, and everyone comes in with a different picture. Everyone is coming in with different resources. So what we think is important and what the research tells us is important is that change over time. So when you look at change over time, you look at change in the proportion of high-risk groups, change in the proportion of low-risk groups. They do tie into the things we want to see. So more high-risk groups is going to result in an increase in a using identity. More low-risk groups is going to increase the recovery identity. And so this tells us that what our tool is capturing is what we wanted to see. We are getting at the content of those social identities. We think that's really important for you guys in clinical practice because this then allows you or gives you a tool that you can use with your clients. It's really interactive, that they are actually really engaged in, where you can get a gauge on the social identities and the things that are underpinning their social identities and how that's changing as they go through the treatment process. So we suggest that you would obviously capture things at baseline so you can get an idea of change, but we have found, that increase in that recovery identity in the first few weeks of treatment is going to predict retention. So the more someone increases their recovery identity, the longer they're going to stay in treatment. It's also correlated with a decrease in their using identity, so this is a bonus. Obviously, you could also use it as in conjunction with an individual recovery plan. You can monitor and plan for changes in that social identity and how people might interact with their social world differently over time, and then as a way to plan exits for supports in the community going forward. So I know what you're all asking, well, how do we do this magical thing that you're talking about? Well, I'm just going to give you a quick rundown because I don't think I've got all that much time left. But we start with some materials here. So we start with scrap paper. We want a big piece of paper to map out our social worlds on. We want textures, we want post-it notes, and sticky dots. So it's a great art and craft tool, and it's a lot of fun. And when we brought it out in our research, people were like, oh, we get to do this again. So that was kind of great. We start by getting people to list their groups, and we find this is less overwhelming for them just to think about the groups they belong to first before they actually have to do anything with that information. So I would encourage you in the audience and you at home to start thinking about that now, so you can think as I go through how this might apply to your social world. we can prompt people to think of any groups that they belong to. It might be their family, friends, people they work with. They might have multiple work groups. They might have a house that they score at, and the occupants of that house is another group that they might feel that they really belong to. We would say don't necessarily put a limit on this. We did in our study, but we didn't find that was too much of a problem. Most of on average, our participants came up with about 4 social groups that they belong to. So think about your own. To start this process, we get our big piece of paper and we write me in the middle of the map. You could write your own name if you prefer, whatever the participant wants, your client wants. And then you grab your post-it notes. So this is where you are adding the names of the groups that you've just come up with to a post-it note that represents how important that group is to you or to your client. Big post-it notes are very important groups. Middle post-it notes are moderately important. Little post-it notes are groups that aren't really that important, but yeah, I'm still a member of them, so I'll put them on. Add your names, as stated. And then add those groups to the map. Now, we didn't have a particular structure for this. We just let people add them where they wanted to. It wasn't really key to any outcomes for us. So if you want to do this in clinical practice and someone has a particular way that they want to put their groups on, perhaps have a conversation about that. Add your dots to your groups. Now, this is meant to be a visual representation, so particularly for big groups, you don't have to have a dot for every single person. You might come up with a way of representing visually what proportion of the group use in different ways. So you're just capturing what's dominant for that group. Then your in common lines. Now this is both between the groups and between the person and the group. So we wanted to look at how much groups have in common with each other and how much the person has in common with themselves. Now we are going to analyse this data at a later date. So for now, there is some relationship to wellbeing. We know from the work that Jen and Kath and friends have done, but we have not analysed that here for now. And then the conflict lines. So the squiggly lines are a little bit of tension. Jagged lines are where there's lots of grrr and people are very angry. And again, between me and the groups themselves. And this can result in a number of different pictures, but it gives you a structure that tells you something about that person's social world and what it means for them and what social influences they might have on their substance using behaviour and what might be underpinning their identities around substance use and around recovery. So that is the end. Thank you very much for that. Happy mapping. And I will hand over to Dan again.
Thanks, Melinda. That was fantastic. So you can all go home tonight, map it out, start worrying, think about who your new friendship group should be, and we'll come back tomorrow happier. So we're going to move on from sort of understanding how we map the worlds to move on to our next presenter, who's going to talk a bit about the relationships, particularly at baseline in terms of social relationships and social identity and how that relates to a number of different factors in the group. It's my pleasure to introduce Professor Kath Haslam, who's Professor at University of Queensland, one of the preeminent leaders in the field of social identity research. And it's our great pleasure that she's joined us today to tell us a bit more about the baseline findings. So please welcome Kath.
Okay, that's not going to work. Which one am I not pressing? So I should be pressing on the left side? Yeah. Okay, excellent. Thanks very much, Dan. As Dan said, the reason I'm actually involved in this program is because, or this research program, is because of my experience in looking at the social determinants of health. But what he didn't say is that I'm actually a novice when it comes to substance use research. So I've actually learned quite a lot in being part of this team, and it's been a pleasure to actually be part of this team. So social relationships matter, right? All social relationships matter, whether they're with the relationships that we have with important individuals or with social groups. But are some social relationships more influential at different points in the recovery process? Now that's the question that we posed in this research, and my focus here will be on those first few weeks of treatment in the TC and how our social relationships actually contribute to people's readiness to pursue recovery at that stage. So we know from the research evidence base that our social relationships are important predictors of getting into addiction, but also getting out of addiction. So people who engage more socially with other people who use substances, well, that tends to be associated with increased personal use and poor motivation to cease. But people who can break away from those using networks and build and strengthen their social ties with others who support recovery, well, that's been demonstrated to be key to abstinence. So, for example, adding one non-drinker to a social network increases the likelihood of abstinence by 27%. And belonging to groups that include people in recovery not only increases your well-being and helps you feel better about yourself, but it also contributes to lengthening recovery maintenance. So what this data is actually showing us or telling us is that our social relationships can be good and bad for us. And understanding the impact that they have on addiction is pretty important in the recovery process. Now, our social relationships that do promote a positive recovery trajectory come in a variety of different forms. They can be relationships that we have with important individuals, whether they be a formal mentor or a family member or a friend. But such support can also come from the groups that we belong to and become part of us, as David highlighted earlier on. Now, we typically lump these social relationships together, and yet we know that these different social relationships that we have will impact in different ways and in different times in the recovery process. So in some contexts and in some situations, it might be a formal mentor who might be really influential, but at other times it might be the full support of a group network that really contributes to helping you sort of get through a rough patch. So if we're interested in understanding how these different relationships play out, lumping them together all the time isn't always going to be that helpful. So in this research, what we wanted to do is we wanted to have a look at the contribution that these different types of relationships made with individuals and with groups to people's readiness for recovery, but also to their identification with the TC in those early days. And that's it, that's important. TC connectedness is really important because we know it actually makes quite a big contribution to longer term recovery outcomes. So these were our particular questions that we posed. Do our social relationships with important people or with groups in the lead up to treatment actually influence how strongly people bond and connect with the treatment community? And do these social ties contribute to a person's readiness for recovery early in treatment? Now, readiness for recovery in treatment, we've defined that in these data in two ways: people's well-being. So if you're in a better place in terms of your well-being, if you have better well-being, you're going to be more open to pursuing recovery, but also in terms of people's recovery capital. And third, to the extent that identifying with the TC is vital to treatment, which previous research has shown consistently, what best predicts whether a person's going to actually connect with the TC early in treatment? So addressing this, just to remind you of to address those questions, we drew on the data that Ramez had actually described earlier on. So just to give you a quick summary, just over 300 people, mean age of about 35, mean days in the TC at the point of collecting data was about 24 days, and for the majority it was their first admission. So addressing our first question about the contribution of the group and individual relationships here, we used correlational analysis. So basically here the numbers are basically ranging from 0 to 1, and the closer the number is to 1, the stronger the relationship. And so what I've got up here too is I've put in bold the significant relationships here. So looking at the variables on the left that we entered into the analysis, we asked people to list the number of group ties they had and also the number of important people that they had relationships with in the 6-month period leading up to treatment. And so you can see the mean number of groups, the mean number of ties over there as well. We also added to this people's strength of connection and bond with the therapeutic community, their quality of life, and their recovery capital in those early weeks. So there are a couple of relationships here that were pretty much expected. So people who had more group ties also had more individual ties. So if you're more connected, you're connected across the board. And we also see here that people with more recovery capital also had better quality of life, as we'd predict. But what about the contribution of different types of social ties? What we can see here quite clearly is that it's actually the number of group ties that is strongly and significantly associated with TC identification and recovery readiness in terms of quality of life. And the stronger your identification with the TC, the better your quality of life and recovery capital. So the better your readiness in terms of those two variables. So what this correlational analysis is highlighting is that it's your number of group ties and your identification and sense of bonding with the TC that's critical to being ready to pursue recovery. So how is it that social groups and connecting with the TC actually contribute to well-being in those early weeks? So we looked at this using mediation analysis, and the whole idea here is just to have a look at the interrelationships between those variables. And so what we found here is that people with more groups actually had, in the lead up to treatment, actually had better quality of life, because the more groups people belonged to, that provided a basis for extending people's group networks to include the TC. And it was the identification with the TC that was particularly important for quality of life, because when we entered that variable into the analysis, the earlier relationship is no longer significant. So while previous research has actually highlighted the importance of connecting and bonding and identifying with the TC for longer term outcomes, what these data are actually showing is that connecting with the TC early is really critical in supporting your well-being at a time when you're actually going through quite a challenging period, trying to adjust to taking on recovery and pursuing recovery and moving into residential treatment. So if TC identification is central, as central as previous research has shown and as this model is actually suggesting, what actually predicts whether people will actually identify with the TC early in treatment? Now, there are a number of variables that could predict this. So the personal characteristics somebody brings in with them to treatment, how old they are, how many years of education they've had, the severity and number of years of problematic substance misuse. Now, when we enter those variables at a first stage in analysis, what we see here is that we're actually not explaining very much of the variance in TC identification. In fact, we're only explaining just 5% of the variance here. And in fact, the only significant individual predictor is years of education. So in a second stage of analysis, we entered a few more variables in that theoretically might predict identification with the TC. The number of previous TC admissions, because connecting, it might well be that people connect more strongly with the TC if they've had previous exposure or experience with a community. And we also entered a couple of other identity variables, recovery centrality and addict centrality, which essentially capture the extent to which a person believes that being in recovery and being an addict is central to who they are. And when we add these variables, we actually explain a significantly, an additional significant amount of variance here. This model now is explaining 26% of the variance in identification with the TC, and education drops out. It's actually seeing yourself in recovery, and that being central to who you are, that's central to whether people are actually going to be identifying with the TC early on in treatment. So if you want to build that sense of belonging and connectedness with the TC early, it's helping people to see themselves as in recovery that's going to be important to that process. So a key message from these early data at that baseline period is that identification with the TC early in treatment is key. And what matters in strengthening that connection is the number of group ties that people have before treatment entry. The more people have, the more likely it is that they're going to connect with the TC. And also what matters is seeing yourself as in recovery, and that being central to who you are. Now, when these fall short, people will find it harder to connect identify and connect with the TC. And we know that when that happens, there's an increased likelihood of withdrawing or dropping out. Now, understanding and working with these factors, I know is challenging. particularly in terms of, particularly in building a recovery identity and actually trying to sustain that, as some of Michael's qualitative data will actually bring up shortly. But what these data actually highlight is that investing time in working with these factors is really important in optimising people's readiness for recovery so that they can actually reap the longer term benefits from being involved in the TC that we know it offers. Thanks very much for your time, and also thank you very much to the TCs who've been really helpful in supporting our data collection. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Kath. Very exciting data, and I think, it really sort of speaks to the sort of the importance of this type of work in terms of really understanding, in our field, what are the big predictors and what can we do more of to strengthen those to enhance outcomes for people entering different phases of treatment. So let's move straight on from Kath's work to introduce Jen Dingle. Associate Prof. Jen Dingle is a clinical psychologist, so a clinician in the field, but also an academic, who's, again, very interested in this area of social identity, social worlds, and its relationship to outcomes in the addiction field. And she's going to be presenting on data around the 6-month outcomes. So how do some of the things that we've talked about, how does that relate to some of the outcomes that we see in the TC at 6 months? So please welcome Jen.
Click on this one. Thank you very much, and thanks to everyone listening in online. Yes, so what happens next? And no, nothing happened. That's not it, that's it. All right, so just to summarise what Kath has just covered, in those early days, so in the first few weeks that a person is settling in and doing that orientation in the therapeutic community, it's important that they are used to being in groups rather than completely isolated. So if they have more sort of groups and networks coming in, they're more likely to feel a bit more comfortable, building themselves a bit of a home and a sense of belonging within the TC, and also seeing themselves in recovery. So keeping those things in mind, I'll go on from there in terms of what happens to that social identification in the first 6 months. Okay, we know that not everyone stays in a 6-month program, even if that's the usual kind of planned time. But these were all of our 300 odd people followed up at the 6-month time point. I'm particularly interested in social identity differentiation here. So this is the difference for one person between seeing themselves as a user still, a substance user, which could be a drinker or it could be another substance user, and seeing themselves as a person in recovery. So the recovery identity here, and according to some previous research that we've done here and elsewhere, the recovery identity acts as a kind of a stepping stone or a transitional identity between the using or addict kind of identity and the non-using, I've left it all behind. So recovery identity is a really important sort of middle point. So we're wanting to know in this new sample whether we're getting that increased differentiation at the 6-month point. And then if that does happen, does it matter? Does it predict outcomes for the individual at the 6 months? So just to try and bring that to life a little more, I've used smoking identity here because I could find the best quotes online. So these are 2 American actors that you might be familiar with. The actor at the top is saying, "I'm a smoker, I'm ashamed to say. I have given it up for many years and I picked it up again. It's a horrible habit. I struggle with myself all the time and I love to smoke." So this actor is saying, although I struggle and I know there's a downside, I'm really invested. This is who I am. I'm a smoker. So that person would have a really high score on the user identity for smoking. Kristen Stewart down the bottom here is saying, "I'm not such a good smoker anyway. I'm starting to move away from it. It's not in my bones. It's not central to how I see myself. I'm going to drop it." So you can see here, this is just a smoking kind of example, and this relates very much to drinking and other substance use as well. But to the extent that a person sees themselves as changing and sees the people, so I'm with the smokers or I'm not with the smokers, that actually is a really important change and part of what's happening in their long-term treatment. So we've seen this in a few previous studies. So Buckingham and colleagues in the UK looked at it in AA and NA mutual support groups. So they had 61 members of mutual support groups, and they found that their non-using identity became more valuable, those whose non-using identity became more valuable than their using identity reduced their substance use and had lower relapses and higher self-efficacy for continued abstinence. They also looked at people who were accessing sort of a quitline online smoking site, so 81 ex-smokers who were using this online site. Again, that non-smoker identity preference was related to much higher self-efficacy, much lower relapse rates back into smoking. In my earlier work with David Best and other colleagues looking at Logan House therapeutic community in Queensland, we tracked at fortnightly intervals after people came into the TC what happened with their strength of identification as a user versus as a member of this recovery community in the TC. So you can see here, before entry they were sort of endorsing quite highly the user identity. I'm a substance user. So it's a 1 to 7 scale. So around 5 is, relatively strong, or 5 and above. But upon entry, that immediately drops down, and now they're fairly strongly identifying as a member of that therapeutic community. So that recovery identity starts to become really important. And the longer that they stay in treatment, the more that this strengthens over time, over the fortnights at exit. And then this was a follow-up point around 7.5 months later. At the same time, we're seeing that their strength of identification as a non-user, as a identification with substance-using peers, so this is the user identity, is starting to really lose its stronghold and really decrease over time. And that differentiation here was a really good predictor of outcomes at the follow-up point. So you can see that after putting in how severe they were at intake, and also their identity points at intake, were only accounting for a fairly small proportion of variance in outcomes, but the shift or the difference between identity was accounting for a third of the variance in how much they were drinking at follow-up, 41% of variance in drinking frequency at follow-up. A bit of a different pattern for other substance use, it has to be said, that the severity was actually still accounting for a quarter of the variance in outcomes for other substance use frequency, but still the identity shift is accounting for some variance. And when you think about life satisfaction at the follow-up point, this is a massive chunk, nearly a half of the variance. So this is an earlier paper that we published. So we wanted to look at this in more than one site and just sort of see whether this is a more widespread kind of pattern. So the current study hypotheses were that we would find that differentiation between the user and recovery identification over that 6 months from early days to time 2. And that greater differentiation would predict these interim outcomes, so longer retention in terms of the days that they stayed at the therapeutic community, a greater commitment to sobriety at 6 months, and greater well-being at 6 months. And this is over and above entering in the sort of severity and demographics and all of those sorts of things that they came in with in the early days. So all of these variables at the bottom here. So again, you've heard about the participants, so I won't go over that again. Just in terms of how we measure these things, it's a very simple 3-item measure that we borrowed from the Buckingham Group's earlier work. So again, rated on 1 to 7, things like being in recovery is a central part of who I am, so identity centrality. I would describe myself as being in recovery, and I identify with this group, so other people who are in recovery. And it's just an average of those 3 items. I've just sort of said that, so the main outcome variables we were looking at were retention, because it's the best predictor of longer term outcomes for substance use, scores on the commitment to sobriety scale, psychological distress on the K10, and also scores on the personal wellbeing index. So here are the mean scores in sort of the, what would you say, poo brown colour there, for user identity. So quite strong at intake, and almost equal amounts of endorsement of both user and recovery identity in the early days. And then this differentiation at 6 months. So the user identity again is very much dropping down, while the recovery identity is strengthening over that 6 months. So again, we're seeing that same differentiation pattern. Does it matter? Yes, it does. So these are robust regression models. So basically what we're doing here is adding in to step 1 this little bit of variance. So this is out of 100%, so really small amounts of variance, 2%, 3%, in these key outcomes being accounted for by the demographics, so gender, age, what kind of substance was their primary concern, past month use of that substance, and number of previous treatment admissions. So these are the indicators of sort of severity at intake. They're not really telling us very much about how they're going to go at 6 months. Then in step 2, we added to all of those contributors their identity as a user or recovery at intake. So that's adding a little bit more variance, particularly to commitment to sobriety. And then at step 3, we had all the same things in the model and added in the difference at time 2 between user and recovery identity, so that differentiation. And again, you can see this really whopping amount of variance is now coming into the model. So 36% more of variance in commitment to sobriety, 8% of variance in how long they're going to stay, and around 27-30% of variance in their psychological well-being. So to wrap that bit up, so we've seen that similar pattern arise that has been found in the UK and also in previous work here in Australia. The SONAR sample showed that differentiation between user and recovery identity was happening by the 6 months, and the extent to which that differentiation occurred was a strong predictor of retention, commitment to sobriety and wellbeing at 6 months. And we know from previous, this is a systematic review of therapeutic community research that Cassandra Perriman, one of my PhD students, and I worked on, that one of the best predictors of longer term outcome is how long you keep people in the therapeutic community. So those are our sort of interim outcome measures. And so these findings highlight the importance of assessing substance-related identities and helping clients to foster a recovery identity during treatment, to really build that sense of belonging within the community, despite the fact that there's all sorts of different pathways in and lots of different, backgrounds of people in there. And then also at the other end, when they're planning for leaving the therapeutic community, providing effective linkage to recovery type groups in the wider community. So groups that are also going to support those recovery goals, if you like, and not be around substance using, because what we find from the maps is that people who move away from their substance using groups often have what we'd call a sort of poverty-like map. They don't have very much going on in their social networks because they've tried to protect themselves. What they need is to replace those with other groups and networks and meaningful social networks where the substance use or heavy substance use is not the norm of that group. And that is it. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks, Jan. So we've got one more speaker and then we'll let you stand up for a couple of minutes while we just rearrange the chairs for some questions. So our last speaker is Dr. Michael Savic, who's a research fellow here at Turning Point, and he's going to be looking at the follow-up period and trying to sort of provide a much more richer experience really around trying to understand what people's personal perspectives were in terms of changes in their identity and what contributed to that. So please welcome Michael.
Thanks, Dan. It's a real privilege to be talking to you all as a part of this symposium today, this seminar. So we've heard what the numbers tell us about the role of social identity in addiction and recovery, but in this presentation I'll be exploring how social identities feature in people's stories and qualitative accounts of their recovery experiences after they've left treatment in particular. We've had some great presentations and some great presentations, some great quantitative work in this topic. So why do we need qualitative research on this topic? Well, I think one of our participants we interviewed articulates this better than I could when he says, I really actually enjoyed taking part in this study. I really respect the fact that you guys are really trying to understand this stuff instead of just looking at the numbers or making assumptions. I think it's vital to do these in-depth interviews in order to gain a better idea of what's happening for people. Now, as a qualitative researcher, I love this guy, I love this quote, I want to frame it. But the qualitative research, which involves asking people open-ended questions and listening to people's stories, enables us to get an in-depth understanding, explore what social identities actually mean to people in their own words, and how they adopt and maintain these identities in different situations. So, given that we know that leaving treatment can be a really challenging time for people, we were interested to explore what happens to people after TC treatment and what factors influence the emergence of particular identities or the maintenance of identities after treatment. So we conducted in-depth interviews with 20 people after the last interview point, so that was at the 12-month point. These lasted 84 minutes on average, which give you a sense of the level of depth and detail we were able to get into. Interviews took a narrative approach, so we kind of explored people's identities, social groups, AOD use and wellbeing before, during and then after treatment. And for this presentation, I'll just be focusing particularly on that after period. The audio recorded data was then transcribed verbatim and was subjected to thematic analysis, where we're looking for common themes, but also some diverse experiences to explore the range of what was happening for people. So as you can see on the screen, pretty similar to the demographics that Ramez and others have described. In terms of at the 12-month mark, around half of participants had completed treatment and were not using it since the last interview, and just over a third were employed at T3, so some suggestion of positive outcomes already. Okay, so as you can see in the pink at the top, we identified 4 different types of identities, AOD and recovery-related identities. These included drug-using, recovery identities, post-recovery identities, and aspirational identities. We'll particularly focus on the recovery and post-recovery identities today. And then the coloured speech bubbles that you can see underneath the pink ones are the factors that were influential in the adoption of those particular identities. And what you'll notice is there's a different pattern or different kind of factors that are involved in the adoption of different types of identities. The colours indicate some cross-cutting themes that were important in the adoption of identities. So the yellow speech bubbles are the ones that are about the role of social groups. The grey bubbles refer to the role of treatment itself. And the blue bubbles highlight the multiple and context-dependent nature of identities. So what factors facilitate recovery identities? So consistent with what we've heard from the other presenters today, engaging with recovery groups was important in facilitating recovery identities for some people. For example, Sharon said, I'm doing well and that's because I'm going to Narcotics Anonymous. I don't have anybody that uses in my life. I wanted to be connected. I wanted to belong somewhere. I was praying that these NA people were going to let me into the good people's group in their club. Here we can see how engagement with recovery groups and not engaging with drug using groups helped Sharon to have a sense of belonging and connection with supportive groups. Recovery identities were not only facilitated by recovery groups, but also by positive treatment experiences and the adoption of ideas about addiction and recovery from treatment. So, for instance, Simon, who reported having a positive treatment experience and who reported doing well after treatment, said, I went into the service with 50-odd days clean and I thought I knew everything about recovery, which I didn't. So that was metaphorically rather than literally beaten out of me pretty quickly. My behaviour was held up to me by workers there. And as he goes on to say, it was like a huge lesson in just realising exactly where I was at, and painful. I think treatment certainly helped me to develop some more acceptance about that I was an addict and that total abstinence was the way forward. What is interesting here and what is not often discussed in the literature is how treatment and recovery groups can shape how people come to understand themselves as someone in recovery or as an addict. While not everyone finds the addict label helpful, those who adopted recovery identities tend to think of themselves as addicts in recovery, which they found helpful for their experience. People who adopted recovery identities after they left treatment also discussed the importance of self-work, personal responsibility and personal growth, which were important in the development of new and improved selves. Or as Sharon says, you're always working on yourself. Normal people don't know that because they're not working on themselves to see how better you compare. We compare because we're really trying to reach, I don't know what we're really trying to reach, really, just trying to be the best person we can, because as always, because we always feel, we're always even told in NA that we're never going to be cured. So I've always got to watch things and work at it. Again, here you can see how what people are told in recovery groups or treatment affects how they view their recovering selves as always needing to do some work, some self-work, and to be vigilant. What is also interesting here is the distinction Sharon draws between herself and normal people, which appears to be helpful for her, but not for all the people we interviewed, and as we'll see a bit later on. This brings me to the next theme around what factors facilitate post-recovery identities. And by post-recovery identities, I mean a range of other identities that didn't centre on drug use or recovery, While drug use and recovery were a part of these people's experiences at particular points in time, they were not important to those people at that 12-month mark when we interviewed them. So similar to notions of being recovered, people often talked about recovery as being temporary and something which they had or wished to move on from or to leave behind. Charlie, who was doing well after leaving treatment, illustrates this well when he says, "It's great when you're in the little TC or recovery bubble, but eventually you have to move on with your life. And recovery is not going to be there for your whole life. But when I look at some of those people that go through the TC and come out, they just don't have other friends outside of the recovery circle. In my experience, recovery peers drop off pretty quickly and they don't really hang around too much. If that was all I had, I could see myself becoming pretty isolated pretty quickly. Like friends as well give me a sense of purpose and meaning in my life, and I feel wanted." So for Charlie and others, leaving recovery identities behind was about moving on with life, engaging with a range of groups beyond the recovery circle, which he found helpful at a particular point in time, but fleeting and temporary and not so helpful now. People who wanted to leave recovery identities behind tended to be ambivalent and sometimes critical of recovery ideas and concepts that they'd learnt through treatment and through recovery groups. So for example, Yara, who didn't graduate from the TC but who's doing well after, says, "Recovery to me, it's kind of a limiting word. It's like being disabled or something. I know it's meant to be a positive thing, but I feel like it's limiting. It's not a major part of my identity. I feel like I've gone beyond that. I'm not saying I'm recovered, but I don't want to think of myself as being in recovery. I want to think of myself as building something new, experiencing life in," here's another treatment word, "a mindful way. Like experiencing the joy of being alive instead of worrying about the shit that I've done in the past and about living in fear about what I'm going to do in the future. It's not a positive word for me." So here Yarrow equates seeing himself as being in recovery with being stuck and constrained. He also feels that the constant self-monitoring that he believes recovery to entail as limiting the possibilities for experiencing himself and life in a full and enjoyable way. And other people also talked about just being normal or wanting to be normal through the adoption of non-recovery identities and everyday practices like exercising, going to the gym, working and so on. Similarly, these people saw themselves as having multiple identities and didn't want to be seen as one kind of person. Many, like Matt, took issue with the label of addict or alcohol in recovery in particular. So Matt says, "It's something that sits with me, but I still don't like being labelled. I don't know, I think at meetings saying, 'Hi, I'm Matt, I'm an alcoholic.' It's like, no, I'm more than that. I'm a lot of things. I just don't want to be labelled as an alcoholic because I know I'm so much more." So other people felt that particular identities, like being a parent, for instance, came out in more in particular occasions, like at family gatherings, highlighting the situated and context-dependent nature of who people identify with at any given time. So what do we kind of make of all this? And I would love to hear your thoughts later as well. But I think the first thing to say is that, consistent with what we've heard today, social groups are important in post-treatment identities. Experiences of treatment and views about treatment and recovery ideas are influential in terms of how identities emerge after treatment. I think this is a positive thing because it means that treatment providers can play a role in fostering identities and group memberships. And for some people that may mean recovery identities, but for others it may mean post-recovery or other kinds of identities. This reiterates the need to be flexible and about person-centered approaches rather than imposing an identity pathway on a potential client or someone. And I also think we need to view identity in its complexity, situational and emerging in different ways depending on a range of factors. So this means that linking people into a diverse range of groups is probably a good thing, as it means people have a range of identities and supports to draw on in diverse range of circumstances and situations. And I think I'll leave it there for now. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Michael. So while you're getting all your thoughts together, and you at home or people on the webcast, if they can think about questions they want to come in, if people just want to stand up for a couple of minutes, we're going to aim to finish in about 20 minutes. So we'll finish before 5. And so if people can start thinking about the questions, toilets to the left, one toilet, so I don't know, we'll go at once. Or if you do, push each other out the way. So just give you a couple of minutes just to set up, and then we'll ask the panel for some questions and get you on your way. Thank you.
Yeah, so for people at home, the question was, do you think we'd get the same kind of, social change in recovery if it wasn't a therapeutic community, if it was some other kind of setting? That's a great question. My background as a clinical psych was training in motivational interviewing, CBT, and I used to run a lot of CBT groups. And you do get a certain amount of groupness and identity formation within any sort of therapeutic group, I imagine. But CBT groups are really different entities to a residential community, because you're obviously not spending as much time, you're not living with each other, you're not having those sort of process circles and giving each other feedback and all the things that happen. So I don't know of any specific research where they've looked at identity processes in, say, a structured CBT or motivational type of group. What I'm aware of in this space is more mutual support groups and I guess residential TC type stuff. But I guess I'd throw that question back to the clinicians here. Have you noticed in other kinds of settings that are not perhaps residential or therapeutic communities that kind of identity formation and transition occurring? Is that something you've noticed that you might not have thought of quite in those terms before? Anyone want to comment from their... Yeah.
I previously worked in a residential non-TC, but I think the environment there was integral to their identity, so whether it was current residents or workforce as well as
I mean, I think I haven't personally worked in sort of opiate treatment clinics, but I know that there's always sort of a hub of people that think of themselves as, I'm a client of the blah blah street clinic. So that even then, when it's an outpatient type of service, you can still get that quite strong community belonging starts to happen. So it'd be an interesting thing for someone to research.
So just to add to Jen's point there, I'm thinking about your question, Leanne, in terms of wider treatment, not just treatment for addiction. And certainly what you see in treatment groups, looking at, whether it's depression groups, CBT for depression, whether it's other, ACT for other sorts of interventions. It's people's sense of connectedness and belonging with the treatment group that's actually going to be doing the power or the work in terms of whether you're going to get some of these outcomes. You're absolutely right. I think that in a therapeutic community, it's much more intense. It's very much more focused, as opposed to sort of maybe some more sort of non-residential type approaches. But if you look at things, evidence in terms of group cohesion, how much people sort of feel that they have a shared goals that they're actually working towards within a treatment group. Those are the things that produce similar sorts of outcomes outside the addiction area. So I think that the message that we're trying to get across here is that it's important to think about how people bond with those groups, whether it's in a residential treatment community or another treatment context. That's the thing that's actually going to be important if you want to make the group a key ingredient to some of those treatment outcomes.
Can I just... Oh.
I was just thinking, as you were talking before, about that there's a bit of a circular argument happening here that, people who are in more groups are better at being in groups. And I'm just wondering if you've got any thoughts about, we know that there are people who are just not good at being in groups. And I'm sure, and those people, whether they have a personality disorder or for whatever reason, have a long history perhaps of being unsuccessfully able to relate to other people in groups. I'm sure those people can develop a recovery identity. So how does that happen? And is it perhaps outside of a therapeutic community? Is that the wrong treatment approach, or whatever ideas you have about that?
As it happens, I've just finished a study a little while ago looking at social anxiety. So individuals who've have been either subclinical or diagnosis of social anxiety prior to going into the TC, so they're in the waiting list, and then we ran an intervention to assist them with a whole variety of anxiety about. Of course, there's obviously when you're about to go into a TC with 50 or 60 people that you're living with and you're socially anxious, it's a bit sort of challenging. And so we actually managed to, through a sort of 5-week, we were going to have a group program, but ironically but no one wanted to come to a group with social anxiety, which I did think was fairly obvious, but everyone kept telling me, oh, no, they need to be in a group. But so we ended up doing it in individually. And those people who did show an improvement in their social anxiety were able to stay in the TC longer. And we know that. So I do think that that you're going to find that people perhaps who don't have a lot of group friends and those sorts of things, we may need to actually have a more tailored approach so that people can be supported to go in if that's the choice of treatment, because it's, otherwise we're only working on those people who already have those sort of social skills. So that was one thing I wanted to say. And I guess the other element to that is that it's also the nature of the group. So it's not, I think there's a lot more to unpack in this data around sort of the importance of the nature of the strength of the relationships, the work that Melinda was doing about the conflict and all those sorts of things. I think that is something that this, some of the data here, given the amount of samples, yep.
Yeah, I just wanted to add something to that. I was doing a secondary analysis of the earlier Logan House data, looking at people who met criteria for diagnosis of PTSD within that sample, which actually was almost half of them, so it was quite widespread. And a lot of the traumas that they reported were interpersonal in nature. So you can imagine that a person coming into a therapeutic community who's had sort of maybe a really difficult family background, something like that, is coming in with a lot of trust issues and is not feeling that comfortable. And we were looking at whether the PTSD comorbidity interfered with or affected the development of this TC recovery identity. And it turns out that it does. So it does influence it, and it also influences retention time, so how long they stay. But I think that's not 100%, it's not like... It's not the end game for them. It just means that if you can assess those things and be aware of those comorbidities like social anxiety, PTSD type things early, you can help to sort of scaffold that and help them to look out for, people are going to get in your face and going to annoy you, and what are you going to do, and sort of do a bit of extra scaffolding around that, because the longer they stay, the more they can actually recover from both the comorbidity and the substance use problem. So it's still really worth their while to give it a go.
I just want 1 second, and just so your colleagues can hear you, and just while you're just getting the mic, I'll just read a comment. So Julie just commented that when she worked at one of the TCs, she used to wonder how recovery could occur in individual treatment, because the community environment is the recovery.
Yeah, the group is the treatment.
Yeah.
For 2.5 years in the city of Melbourne here with homeless folk, and one of the big things, and great outcomes, but we're too after it, and that's the big thing, accommodation. Is if you haven't got safe housing, what have you got? And that's what it comes down to with a lot of folk. That's a really just a huge thing, a safe place to live, and then a lot of things can come out of that. And that's what a lot of people haven't got. I'm not sure where do we go, I don't know.
We all agree.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hi, what advice would you have for sort of AA settings in which there might be a culture of people sort of labelling themselves as addicts or alcoholics? What kind of advice would you give for them when it comes to that and their recovery and that kind of stuff?
Do you have some?
No,
you
no,
go.
it's fine.
So I think I heard that what sort of advice would you give to people who are uncomfortable with taking on that addict or alcoholic identity in, say, AA? Right. Right. Yeah, okay, it's a great question, and something that we've sort of thought about a lot during this process. It's part of the credo of those mutual support groups to kind of keep that front and centre in your mind, so that you don't kind of go off the bit, off the abstinence path. And for some people that's a really helpful thing, because it keeps the vigilance and keeps the plan there in place. But I've also seen and worked with people who that's not such a useful thing. And you saw some of the comments in the interviews saying, I really want to, I'm more than this. I'm more than just an alcoholic. I've got lots more stuff that says who I am, and I'd really rather leave that behind. I think that's a decision that rests with your client. I don't think any of us really know the answer for them. They need to know and tell us what's going to work best for them. And if they are needing to make that transition, it might not be best for them to go to a mutual support group that's very strong on, you know, my name's Genevieve, I'm an alcoholic. You know, that just might not be a very useful thing. Having said that, we've found that all sorts of other groups are supportive. It doesn't have to be a drug and alcohol related group as such. It could be, you know, park run, or it could be a choir. It doesn't really matter as long as it informs that person's identity in a way that's non-substance related and is strength based. So I guess that's my general sense of what the data is telling us.
Yeah, thanks, Jen. Great question. And I think, just adding to Jen, I think maintaining the full range of possibilities in terms of, you know, these are a range of options in terms of group belonging and adopting different kind of identities. Have a go and see which ones kind of resonate with you and which ones don't. I think where we can maintain as much possibility as possible rather than narrowing in and imposing things, I think we're always going to come out with a better result for people.
Yeah, got it. No worries, guys. It's a great talk, and I've heard a lot of this stuff before, and it's really, really good. But so when I'm sitting and listening to it, I'm thinking about, well, what really are groups? So groups are made up of individuals, right? And within that are the relationships and the connections that are formed. So you might have a group with a lot of people who say don't agree with everything that goes on in the group, but they've made this one connection. I'm generalizing, I guess, a little bit about clients from the past. I'm sharing these experiences, right? They'll say, oh, there's one person in the group who, you know, I kind of get along with. That's why I keep going there. That's why I keep going to NA, AA, whatever. Maybe I don't agree with what's going on. So was there any kind of, within this kind of test for the individual connections to test the strengths? Because what is that? One individual relationship built up some strength, built up trust. Was there some kind of part category for individual relationships? Because there could be two people like, yeah, we're here. Maybe we don't agree with all this other stuff. And I always put it down to, you know, like cults. You know, there's cults everywhere, kind of different cults. And I reckon there's a lot of people in those cults who probably don't agree with everything that goes on in the cult, but they're kind of there because they kind of get along with some people and they play tennis, or who knows, I don't know. But you kind of know what I mean? Get the idea? I don't know what the question was, but...
I'm not sure whether I'm going to be able to answer it, but I think that it's certainly, I mean, when we're talking about groups, and by talking about groups, we're not turning around at the same time saying that individual relationships with important people are irrelevant. All of those relationships matter. They matter in different ways and at different times. I think that what we're talking about when it comes down to understanding the influence of groups is when those groups become an important part of who we actually are. So when we talk about social identity, we're talking very much about this idea that there are groups that we're part of and that we belong to that become an important part of our self-definition. So when we think about our self-definition, there's some things about us personally, personal characteristics that are unique to us, but there are also the part of us that's related to those groups. And it's those groups, when we're actually seeing ourselves in that way, when we identify, when we've got that sense of connection and belonging, that's when they actually have an influence. Now, individuals can also have that particular influence, and we've seen that through mentorship programs, through those, I'm going along because of this particular person. Under those circumstances, when they're even in that particular group context, there might still be some elements of the group that they're actually subscribing to or assigning themselves to. So in that kind of context, it might be a mixture of factors that actually is influencing outcomes. It's the importance of the combination of the individual relationship as well as the group itself, because you wouldn't have that individual relationships perhaps without the group actually being in existence. So sometimes it becomes hard to tease some of those elements apart. So I think that the main thing we're trying to say here is that it's important to kind of take on board all of those relationships, but just to be able to understand what role they're actually playing.
Thanks. And also, just to add to that, I think even in terms of in the role that groups play, kind of characterising groups, that groups act in different ways, even groups that we think might be, from the outset, they look potentially positive or supportive, a family, a work group, but we know that those can be sometimes very stressful family relationships, and groups can be not supportive. So thinking about under what situations groups are supportive and under which situations they're not. So I think some nuance there is also important, rather than characterising things as a binary positive or good or bad.
So it's almost 10 to 5. It's a very stuffy room at the moment, but we've all bonded together. We're all part of one really good group that's really enjoyed a positive experience together. So that's good for our well-being. So I'm going to ask the panel just if they can just say one sort of maybe take-home message from sort of what they might have presented today that they want you to take home with. So, but while they're thinking of that, I just want to promote next Wednesday here is the next talking point. So next Wednesday, 1 till 2. The presentation will be on Hep C, so how we eradicate it by 2020. So for people who are interested in that, that's next Wednesday at 1 o'clock here. Again, if people can't make it, be online. If there's people in your teams who are interested in that, please promote it. It won't be online, no. So you've got to come here, otherwise you won't see it, and it's not to be missed. So let's just move to our panel. So Michael, any final comments?
I think for me it's just about acknowledging the diversity of kind of group and identity and recovery experiences, and kind of letting the client kind of guide how that takes shape and manifests, and acknowledging that they're diverse ways of getting on that pathway.
For me, I think it's recognising that our social relationships can be good and can be bad for us. And helping people to actually understand the context and the situations within which that happens is actually really important. And a final plug again for Groups for Health Addiction Recovery, because that's in that program we are trying to achieve that and trying to raise people's awareness of that.
I wasn't a presenter, so I'm going to reflect more broadly. I've come into this project as a sort of individual behaviour change psychologist, looking at self-control and impulsivity and reward sensitivity and all of the things. So it's been a fantastic learning experience, and I'm very, very persuaded by the importance of social processes and social change and connections. And I think probably the thing that I'd like us to unpack more is the sort of meaning of some of these social connections, along with some of the things that David Best said around actually understanding the sort of broader meaning of where you want to go to past that sort of using lifestyle. And so I guess that would be my reflection.
Thank you. For me it would be about a lot of people I've seen in these different projects have done actually really, really well while they're in the therapeutic community. And then there's a bit of a dropping off point. So for me it would be about you guys having this really important role to play in linking people into other groups and other sorts of organisations. And we had some people come off the Logan House project and join the School of Hard Knocks project that I also happened to be looked at, and they joined the creative writing group. And those guys kept going, and they joined the open writing group at the State Library of Queensland, and they just went from strength to strength, because here was something that was a bit new when they started, but they were really good at it and they got a lot out of it, and now I'm a writer, so that's my new identity. So, I mean, it doesn't have to be that, but they probably wouldn't have done that just off their own steam. They needed that assertive linkage, and they actually had a minibus that took them from the TC into the groups and back, and then after they'd left, they had this new group that was really important to them. So I think the linkage is going to be really critical to sort of continue on that trajectory of I guess, recovery. Yeah.
So let me take that opportunity. So for just to plug, just before we close, and to thank everyone, that today's presentations will be uploaded on the Turning Point website under the Talking Point page, I think. And the Turning Point YouTube. So if you enjoyed it and want to enjoy it again, please go there. Let me just take this opportunity just to thank the TCs who really work with us very closely and very supportive in helping the whole project over 3 years. So we really want to thank them for all their help. We also want to thank all the participants who really gave a lot of their time and shared a lot of their experiences, and obviously we couldn't have done this without them, and it was really great to learn so much from them.
And can I say a quick thank you to Jock McKenzie, because he did pretty much all of the interviews up in Queensland, and he's finished his contract, but he's here in spirit, so well done to Jock.
Oh, hi, Jock.
Hi.
So let me take this opportunity to thank the whole team. So Jock, Ramez, Melinda, Jen, Petra, Kath, Michael, and of course David, who's here in spirit, so we can all feel his presence. And particularly thanks to the speakers today, to Ramez, to Michael, Kath, to Jen and Melinda, who unfortunately had to leave, and to David. And particularly thank Ramez for putting today together and getting everything together and everything organised for the webinar. And thank you for making the time and coming and listening to us. So thanks so much.